Hello, everyone. Welcome to our second plenary of the Whistler Conference, the World Symposium on Transport and Land Use Research. I'm Kelly Clifton. I'm a professor at Portland State University. And today we have a panel of academics and practitioners to talk about smart growth or growth management policy here in Portland, Oregon. And when I conceived of this panel, a couple years ago, I thought you would all be joining me here in Portland and we could do some field trips to see this and maybe drink wine and see how the urban growth boundary is preserving our local agriculture and well, life had other plans for us. So now we're going to have this conversation. It's going to be lively like the whole conference has been so far. I don't know what time it is in your time zone, but you can drink some Oregon wine for us if it's appropriate. I want to tell the panelists who have not been involved in the conference, we have over 30 countries represented and authors from 6 continents. So we're going to work harder to get Antarctica into the next Whistler. So this is a very international forum, and for that reason, I want to talk a little bit about Oregon's, what is this panel going to talk about? And so Oregon has a unique system of land use and transportation planning. It requires every urban area to have an urban growth boundary. And Portland has, or the Portland metro region, has a unique form of government, a metro, and it's a regionally elected government to help deal with some of these issues that we've been talking all about all through this conference. So the way we're going to organize this panel, I'm going to introduce our panelists, and I just did something to my Zoom. There it is. And so we're going to play a video for Professor Cy Adler. And then each of the panelists are going to talk for just a few minutes from their experience and their perspective on the urban growth boundary. And then Michael Anderson is going to moderate the session, and he has some questions he'd like to ask the panelists. And then you, the audience, can chime in as well. So just to get started, our panelists include Dr. Cy Adler. He conducts research about urban planning in the city, region, and state, and he has published 3 books on planning specifically about the Pacific Northwest, including Oregon Plans, The Making of an Unquiet Land Use Revolution, a dissection of the political history of the Oregon statewide land use planning program. He is currently writing a book-length complement to that work, a historical analysis of the Oregon growth boundary around Portland metropolitan area. And he is a professor at Portland State University. He joined us here in 1982. Laura Weigl is the planning manager for the city of Milwaukee. It's a small city just south of the city of Portland. Her current work includes revising the zoning code to implement the recently adopted comprehensive plan for the city. And prior to working for the city of Milwaukee, she was the long-range planning manager for the city of Hillsborough. This is another city in the suburbs of Portland to the west, and she developed a concept plan for the urban growth boundary expansion in the metro area. And then she has also worked in the city of Lake Oswego for 6 years, where she focused on neighborhood planning. So lots of experience there in how we implement our urban growth boundary. Dr. Maria Zapata is an associate professor of urban studies and planning at Portland State University, and she's also the director of our homelessness research and action collaborative. She received her PhD in regional planning from the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. And she was recently named one of Portland's unelected leaders by the Portland Mercury for her role in using her research to help us understand homelessness. Metro Council President Lynn Peterson leads the nation's only elected regional government, representing over 1.7 million Oregonians here in the Portland area. In this role, Peterson directs the staff of more than 800 and is charged with affordable housing and perks investments, protection of farms, forest and water resources, planning investments in transportation, overseeing tourism and cultural venues, as well as management of garbage and recycling. A transportation and land use expert with degrees in engineering and planning. She served in Salem as a senior advisor to former Governor John Kitzhaber, and before a 3-year tenure as director of the Washington State Department of Transportation. And then Michael Anderson, our moderator, is a Portland-based writer and policy analyst who focused on housing and transportation for the Sightline Institute, the Pacific Northwest Sustainability think tank. He previously covered the same issues over 10 years as a journalist in Oregon and Washington. So with this fantastic panel, I am going to ask that we play the video from Dr. Cy Adler, who couldn't join us today. And then after that, we will return to the panelists.
Hello, I'm Cy Adler, Interim Dean, College of Urban and Public Affairs, and I'm very pleased to be joining you for this discussion, if virtually, and talk about the early history of the Portland urban growth boundary, a topic that I've been studying for a while in the context of research about the Oregon statewide planning program. The growth boundary around the metropolitan area encompasses 27 local governments, each one of which has its own comprehensive land use plan that incorporates the line. The original Portland UGB was planned and adopted during the 1970s by a regional entity that remains unique in the United States, Metro, the only directly elected multi-county regional government. It was acknowledged at the end of 1979 as compliant with the statewide urbanization goal by another unique governmental entity, the Oregon Land Conservation and Development Commission, LCDC. The urbanization goal was one of the first 14 legally binding statewide land use goals adopted at the end of 1974 by LCDC, which was established by a state law enacted in 1973. That law has been recognized as a national planning landmark by the American Planning Association. Acknowledging the Portland UGB as the most important post-goal adoption decision LCDC has ever made, and it was also a singular moment in the history of American land use planning. Planning to contain urban growth actually started before the statewide system was implemented. A regional land use plan done by the Columbia Region Association of Governments at the end of 1970, pursuant to US federal government mandates, included an urban containment line. Despite the line, the regional planners who produced the plan labeled it Trend City because it was largely a composite of plans that had already been done or were being produced by local governments in the region that were based on the continuation of the sprawling pattern of land development that emerged after World War II. That regional plan was criticized harshly by many local government planners in the metro area, including those who were producing the Trend City plans, and especially by City of Portland planners. The critics argued that accommodating a trend was an abdication of the regional planners' responsibility to examine the consequences of doing so, and the necessity of developing a plan to mitigate the likely future problems that accommodation would yield. The regional planners were themselves troubled by the continuation of the sprawling pattern they saw in those local plans, and during the early and mid-1970s, they sought to transform it. Transforming Trend City has always been and continues to be a challenge, even in the context of the substantial institutional innovations that have occurred. The statewide goals that took effect in 1975 intersected very awkwardly with that earlier adopted plan and with subsequent efforts to transform Trend City. A revolt in the early mid-1970s that led to the substitution of a light rail transit line for a planned downtown radial freeway, though, began to move the region in a Trans-City transformative direction. Goal 14, urbanization, in conjunction with Goal 3, agricultural lands, and Goal 4, forest lands, were intended to deal with the threat that Trend City sprawl presented to Oregon's then 3 leading economic sectors: forestry, agriculture, and tourism. The other major motivation for the adoption of the statewide land use program was the prospect of higher costs to provide infrastructure and services in the context of sprawling metropolitan area development. The resource lands issues and infrastructure cost concerns were linked from the beginning. Boundary planning was intended to provide the context for transitioning land from rural to urban uses while maintaining livability and advancing the state's interests in land use as expressed in the goals. In conjunction with the other 13 LCDC adopted goals, the boundary was intended to shape land use related decisions inside and outside the line. Unlike a permanent greenbelt, though, the boundary was intended to be a growth management tool. Boundary changes over time were expected. The lengthy process of producing, adopting, and acknowledging a regional boundary was extremely complex and intensely controversial. Lacking precedents, what the goals legally required, what was politically feasible at all governmental levels, and what reflected internationally prominent professional planning norms were all contested in multiple settings, including in the media and in the courts. A watchdog organization emerged in 1975 that was unique in the United States at the time, 1,000 Friends of Oregon, an environmental movement-influenced public interest law firm. It engaged legally and politically with land development industry, as well as farmer organizations throughout the regional boundary planning and state-level acknowledgement period. Thousand Friends often charged that planners and elected officials were violating goal-related legal requirements in order to build and maintain political support for Trend City-oriented local plans. Friends attorneys argued that power biased the technical analyses and resulting plans that local and regional planners presented to state-level decision makers for acknowledgement. Goal 14 included 7 factors intended to frame boundary planning. The first 2 determine aggregate land needs to accommodate future levels of population and economic activity within the region, and 5 factors determine where within the region needed land should be located. The 5 factors were efficient provision of public facilities and services, efficient use of land within and on the fringe of existing built-up areas, carrying capacity, which includes assessments of environmental, energy, economic, and social consequences, retention of higher quality agricultural land, and compatibility with nearby agricultural activities. Goal 14 also stipulated that establishing and changing growth boundaries shall be a cooperative process involving local governments. Goal 2, which outlined the comprehensive land use planning process LCDC wanted local and regional planners to follow, required fact-based analyses and also explicit linkages in plan documents between those analyses and proposed actions. A Gedesian approach, survey before plan. Population in the Portland metro area grew rapidly during the 1960s and early mid-1970s. Commercially productive farmland was being urbanized. Outside the growth boundary, Goal 3 agricultural lands required that areas composed of higher quality soils, identified by federal government and Oregon State University soil scientists, be zoned exclusively for farm use. The identification of those farm use zones was a key consideration when dealing with the 5 location factors. Thousand Friends argued that the boundary proposed for acknowledgement by LCDC contained far more land, including commercially productive farmland, than would be needed to accommodate forecasted amounts of population and economic activity. The housing goal required regional planners to do an inventory of buildable lands that would be suitable, available, and necessary for residential use inside a growth boundary during the next 20 years. That was a challenging mandate that engendered serious disagreement. Concerns about boundary-caused increases in the price of land and consequent increases in the cost of housing inside the boundary were raised by home builders and realtors during the 1974 goal development process and thereafter. Industry leaders also worried that a boundary would encourage speculation that would drive up prices. Regional planners during the early mid-1970s contemplated the need for a Henry George-inspired land value-based tax approach inside and outside a boundary to reduce the impact of speculative behavior by landowners and encourage denser, more compact development, including more multi-family units than in the past. Land inside the line would be taxed more than buildings and vice versa outside the line. The housing goal also stipulated that local government plans shall encourage the availability of adequate numbers of needed housing units at price ranges and rent levels which are commensurate with the financial capability of Oregon households and allow for flexibility of housing location, type, and density. Plan making in the context of that interest in prohibiting exclusionary zoning, especially in rapidly growing suburban jurisdictions, increase the level of conflict during plan making regarding future housing supply and demand. Advocacy on behalf of implementing the housing goal was one very important manifestation of the Thousand Friends agenda to encourage more dense, compact, transit-oriented development inside the boundary. And the watchdog also played a critically important role in the elaboration of the transportation goal to advance that agenda. In the context of considering a circumferential freeway proposed to be built on the edge of the metropolitan area that would cross over the urban growth boundary onto rural land in the latter 1980s, LCDC adopted in 1991 the Transportation Planning Rule, which elaborated on a stipulation in the transportation goal, quote, to avoid principal reliance on any one mode of transport. Creating a land use context that would encourage transit, bicycle, and pedestrian modes of travel became a central feature of the rule, and the regional government and local governments in its jurisdiction were required to revisit acknowledged local comprehensive land use and transportation plans and revise them if necessary to achieve it. The Loop Track project, Land Use, Transportation, Air Quality, was developed by 1,000 Friends of Oregon, funded in part by the federal government, to demonstrate to regional and state government agencies that alternate land use and transportation policies could make the proposed freeway unnecessary and reduce reliance on automobiles. The rule included targets to reduce vehicle miles traveled per capita in the metropolitan area, as well as to reduce the number of parking spaces per capita. In addition, local governments were required to enhance street connectivity in their jurisdictions, a return to a grid-oriented approach to street layout and an end to cul-de-sacs, and to orient buildings towards streets where transit service was available, rather than placing building entrances away from the street and facing off-street parking spaces. The proposed freeway was dropped. Loop Track won a national award for its work from the American Planning Association in 1996. Inserting an authoritative regional government entity has always been controversial in the context of a lengthy list of deeply rooted dimensions of metropolitan regional political economy. Local governments continue to compete with each other to retain and attract mobile private sector firms and middle and higher income home-owning households. Local desires to exclude housing units affordable by lower income households has continued to manifest as well. The same planning and implementation issues that roiled boundary planning during the 1970s continue to recur. Metro revisits the boundary and determines whether or not it should be expanded every several years, and has established a sophisticated land monitoring system to facilitate analyses relevant to that decision. Required periodic boundary planning processes focus attention on contentious issues, and the findings produced by planners invite scrutiny and heighten conflict about decisions confronting elected officials. implementing a Minneapolis-St. Paul-inspired regional tax-based sharing program to mitigate competition among local governments, though, or the land value taxation approach to mitigate speculation hasn't yet been feasible politically. The economic, social, and environmental concerns that motivated efforts to insert state and regional considerations into local government decisions in the 60s and 70s are similar to those confronting planners today. Climate change, housing affordability, race and class-related exclusionary practices, and the costs of building and maintaining infrastructure. In the 70s, the concept of carrying capacity, Ian McHarg's ideas about land suitability, and plans developed for the Stockholm and Copenhagen regions, as well as a 60s plan for Washington, D.C., were embraced by planners influenced by a burgeoning environmental movement. Sustainability as an organizing principle for planning theory and practice emerged several years later. More recently, climate change-related resilience provides an overarching framework. All three have targeted sprawl and have sought a more dense, compact, transit, bicycle, and pedestrian-oriented spatial pattern of development focused on a flourishing downtown district. The future of that professional norm in the context of the pandemic experience, though, is now, as we all know, a subject of intense discussion among the community of planners and more generally. Thank you very much.
All right, and Dr. Adler couldn't be with us, but he was nice enough to prepare that background video. And as I said in his bio, he's written books about the urban growth boundary. So there's plenty of information to be had from Dr. Adler. I also want to say that Jennifer Dill was nice enough to put together an informational packet that is in the feed loop session. You can download a PDF that gives you a map of the Portland region and some comparative information about population growth in Portland and how we compare to maybe some other cities in the United States. But with that, I'm going to turn this over to Michael Anderson, who is going to facilitate the panel discussion today. And then after that, we will open it up for questions after he's had his time with the panel. So take it away, Michael.
Thanks so much, Dr. Clifton. I am going to pass things first to Ms. Weigl, who is a practitioner in all of the theories that we just heard about, and I'm hoping that she can give a brief presentation about some of her work and thoughts.
Thank you, Michael. Thanks, everyone. I wish I were here to meet you all in person, but I'll look at your little names on a screen instead. So fast forward from everything that I was saying to 2018, right? So 2018 is when I was working for the city of Hillsborough, and Hillsborough is on the very edge of the urban growth boundary. And we had some areas throughout the region. There are different types of areas along the urban growth boundary designated as urban reserve or rural reserves. And so as a jurisdiction that had urban reserves, that means that someday we would develop those as urban. And then there are some areas that are designated as rural reserves, which are not touchable for at least 50 years when we go back and analyze the urban growth boundary, or Metro does. So we had the opportunity back in 2018 to assess whether or not we were interested in expanding the urban growth boundary. And the city decided that it was, and we went through a process with Metro to do so. And so some of the things that we had to propose, we kind of had to work through and make a case to Metro for allowing the expansion, is we kind of had to prove that we were attempting to meet all of the housing needs that had been developed throughout the region. And as part of our housing needs analysis, which is looking at your population, your projected population growth, and seeing if you actually have enough housing within your city to accommodate the housing need in future, in the future, 20 years out in the future. We had to look at, as I was talking about, infrastructure, understanding if there was infrastructure feasible for these areas, and then how much it would cost, and then figure out a plan to pay for it. One of the sticking points in the past is that when some areas back in the last urban growth boundary expansion, they didn't have the infrastructure, didn't have means to get the infrastructure, and didn't have a funding plan to build the infrastructure. So one thing that had changed, the way that we do urban growth boundary expansions has changed over time. And I will say that this last time around, I think it was one of the most successful expansion conversations that we've had in this region, because there were some very clear parameters set forth for jurisdictions that wanted to expand. And one of those things was that you actually wanted to expand, that you could provide the infrastructure, and that you had the governance in place to handle that expansion. In past cases, that wasn't necessarily true. And so I think the metro region really adapted to make sure that those things were in place before expansion areas were allowed to go forward. We had to look at any barriers to mixed use, walkable development in our main downtowns, like where our downtowns, existing downtowns, town centers, were they producing the kind of development that was walkable, bikeable, to try to show that we were meeting Metro's 6 desired outcomes. And so Metro has these 6 desired outcomes, which is they're creating vibrant communities. We have a sustained economic competitiveness and prosperity, safe and reliable transportation choices, leader on climate change, clean air, clean water, healthy ecosystems, and equity. So that was part of our narrative that we had to kind of prove to Metro that we as a city were also striving to meet those 6 desired outcomes, and then give examples of those things. So you put together a packet and you talk about your infrastructure, you talk about the outcomes, the desired outcomes, and then part of the process is it used to be that you would not develop a concept plan for the area before it was brought into the urban growth boundary. Part of the change this last time around was that you actually had to go and develop a concept plan that was reflective of those 6 desired outcomes as part of the consideration, and then present that concept plan to Metro, and then have kind of a review by Metro Council to ensure that what you were proposing was desirable. And so we were able fairly easily to make that case, because in the city that I was working for had been doing a lot building. We have a light rail line that comes out. We've done a lot of transit-oriented development. We had been working for a long time to get these 6 desired outcomes kind of built in the city. And so that part was it wasn't that complicated, that part of it. I think that where it got a little more complicated is that we had, after we kind of made the case to Metro that we could accommodate this growth and that we were prepared to do so and we could do it well, then it was also, the whole proposal was reviewed by an outside, it's called a city readiness advisory group. And this advisory group looked at there were 4 cities at the time looking to expand the urban growth boundary. And they looked at all 4 of the proposals and kind of gave some feedback that, while was not related to what we were asked to do for Metro, there was some good feedback that we as a jurisdiction didn't really have kind of the ability to ensure that these things would happen. And so there's a couple of things. I think that one of their concerns was that the density that is actually required we have to have 10 dwelling units per acre. The density that's required in the urban growth boundary expansion areas, and also that's required just throughout the metropolitan region, isn't really always going to get the transit. And so you're not going to get transit building at 10 dwelling units per acre. And so that is something that I wish that we had more of an ability to push forward, is requiring more density actually at levels that would get you transit, but we don't really have that authority to do that throughout the planning process. I think that more affordable housing needed to be incorporated into the expansion areas, that it should be a requirement to somehow find a way to get affordable housing units built in the expansion areas. And I think that one thing is good is that the mix of housing is getting better and better and better as we've gone through time. There's been this, a lot of single family housing, but we're getting better at providing a better split between the different types of housing units. And new legislation just came through from the state saying that we actually have to allow different types of housing all throughout the communities. So I will just say that I think it's the process for expanding the urban growth boundary has gotten a lot better over time. And I think that it was really, this last time around, it wasn't as contentious as it has been in the past. And so I give major props to Metro for making those changes. And I know that over time we'll continue to get better with it. And I do hope, and my last is just make people build the density to get the transit. And then you're gonna fix a lot of things because it's a unique opportunity to build little mini cities on the edge. And so I wish that we had figured out the magic way to build little cities that can deliver all the things that we want. So here's hoping that the next urban growth boundary expansion that we'll have the opportunity to do that.
Thank you so much. I'm not sure if you're all familiar with the publication The Onion. There's an article in that from a long time ago, Urban Planner Trapped in Traffic of Own Design. Dr. Zapata is a planning professor trapped in traffic of someone else's design, or has been. So she'll be joining us by phone. Dr. Zapata, oh, you're back. Fantastic.
I made it.
All right.
We were joking before this session started when I was calling in via the car that it would all depend on whether there was a bridge lift coming into Portland and if the traffic over that particular bridge was going to block me from making it, but we made it.
All right.
If there's any airport traffic designers in the audience, I'd love to have a chat after my presentation to talk about my traffic issue I just experienced. But yes, I am Dr. Marisa Zapata, and I am an associate professor at Portland State University as a land use planner. And I also have now developed a second career that I actually think is much more connected than it sounds, as the director of our homelessness research center here at Portland State. And I'm really thrilled to be here with Lynn Peterson. President Peterson is, of course, leading Metro at a very interesting point in time as Metro has suddenly found itself as one of the leaders in our area of trying to address homelessness. And so how does this start to go together? What does this have to do with the UGB, the land use system? I'm not going to pretend to answer all of that by any stretch, but I do want to highlight some things that I think are particularly powerful about the work here in the Portland region. One of the things that I was trying to think through how to potentially frame this to transportation researchers who are at the intersection of transportation and land use. And what I have found in working in homelessness, I find a lot of the things that we're doing really amazingly as a field and things that we're missing out on. And of course, my work is all framed around equity. And so thinking about what are we getting right when we're thinking about forecasting scenarios and putting together really amazing comprehensive land use plans for 20 and 30 and 50 years out. And what are we missing because we're also not deeply connected to the present in a way that really, I think, attaches to understanding the inequities that people are experiencing today. And so I have found that, thinking about the fact that as land use planners, we think holistically. We think about, I'm getting a weird message. All right, I'm ignoring the message. We think about how there are intersections, right? And so we're thinking about land use and transportation. And I always love the argument of whether is it the land use first or the transportation first, or which is going to come first and which is going to come second. And then of course it's what kind of land use. And housing is of course our biggest land use ever in a region or a place, right? We've got to have places for people to live. And in thinking about the urban growth boundary and the creation of the urban growth boundary, goal 10 was also essential in the development of the state land use system. Goal 10 is the housing goal that Cy Adler was mentioning earlier, but I do want to read a little bit about what that goal actually says. I'm going to paste in a few things into the chat that include some reports I'm going to mention, including a link to goal 10. So goal 10 is actually saying there has to be an adequate housing supply. It's a fundamental building block of a healthy community. There has to be provision of housing for a community, and it can take many forms and should be built to serve people at a variety of income levels. It should be a housing supply that meets community needs. It offers people a range of different places to live, different community densities to choose from, and does not overburden the financial resources of any group living there. right? And so this is the basis and the framework to think about how are we going to actually provide housing to the range of people that need it. And historically, we might think about that as like, let's just think about some basic housing types as land use planners, and we're done with it, right? We said apartments, we said single family homes, cool, we're out. But of course, we know it's not as simple as that. And then if we actually want to take affordability seriously, then we have to be thinking about a range of housing types, but also different ways that people can access that housing. And so one of the things that I really like to think about and look at is that, of course, the new bills that have come forward recently are going to really revolutionize and make us think differently about how we try to provide those housing types. And frankly, Michael might just be our facilitator, could probably talk a lot more articulately about this than I could at this point. He's had a couple of really great articles, one that just came out from Sightline that talks about specifically the Portland version of what is now known as House Bill 2001, where we have gotten rid of single family home zoning exclusively, right? So you can have your single family home, but now you have the option to have multiple plexes on one parcel. And in terms of being able to expand the opportunity to serve people from different income groups, this will be essential. Now, what Housing Goal 10 and what HB 2001 and what the parallel process in Portland, which is called a residential infill project, don't actually do is make that housing affordable, right? And so we might have the different housing types, and certainly they will cost, the smaller houses or housing types will cost less. That does not mean that they are actually, in fact, affordable. And so we continue to face, like every place in this country, an affordability crisis. One of the things I think to always think about with Portland, we're known for being progressive, but we also weren't that expensive for a very long time. And so, as Sai was talking about these concerns about constraints on supply and land and whether that would exacerbate housing costs, when you compare, and still when you compare Portland housing to the rest of the West Coast large cities, we are still much more affordable. Let's put an asterisk, affordable, compared to those other places. And so Portland wasn't a big hit place to move to until probably the last decade or so, although we could have a debate on when that actually starts to happen. And so this is where we start to see the inequities that had already been happening in terms of housing, who had access to housing and who did not, become even more intense. We know that in the city of Portland proper, that the average Black family could not afford to rent the typical, could not afford the typical rent in any neighborhood in the city of Portland. We know that Latinos and Native Americans also struggle in similar ways. And so we know that this is also not just about income, but also about race. And so everything that we're seeing today builds on these legacies of inequity in terms of housing. And this kind of question of, for me, is how much can we expect the urban growth boundary itself to actually fix any of these issues versus all of the other things that come with the urban growth boundary. And so to me, that is really where the power is, right? It's the being able to say that, yeah, we want to have the densities that the UGB and Goal 10 empower us to have, to allow, to be able to provide more housing types. But if we really want to take seriously our commitment to providing housing at a range of incomes that makes it affordable for all people, we also have to be doing and thinking about additional things. And some of those things are things that have been happening in the Portland region. There's two housing bonds, and one is at the city level and one is at the metro level. The two bonds are being used to fund the construction and procurement of affordable housing to be able to increase the actual supply of affordable housing. And the most recent one is the homelessness services, the supportive housing services measure. And that is actually services that would go along to provide supports for people who are on the cusp of or who have been experiencing homelessness. Now, if you've been looking at the newspapers, a lot of the newspapers are covering homelessness in the West Coast and in Portland. You'll see a lot of people camping outside. One of the things I think to keep in mind as researchers is what I would like to see a lot more analytical precision when we're talking about what does homelessness and housing insecurity mean or actually look like? Homelessness is much more than just the people who are sleeping in tents on the street that you can see. One of the reports that I put into the chat is a link to a report where we did an estimate based on different data sources from around the region to get an estimate for the number of people we would estimate are experiencing homelessness in the Tri-County area. We came up with, if you looked at just the estimates for people who are living outside, living in cars, tents, RVs, etc., we came up with about 5,500 people in 2017 across the year would have experienced homelessness. When you use a more expansive definition and you think about the number of people who are also living in people's sheds, attics, garages, unsafely doubled up, you're looking at a number closer to 40,000. And those are really different numbers. And those are numbers that matter, in particular when we're thinking about land use. Simply trying to decide how many housing units we need for people who are experiencing homelessness is actually revolutionary in land use and housing conversations, right? And so saying that we're not planning shelter, we need enough housing units for 40,000 more people than we would have otherwise. And where should those people be able to live? And that is one of these transportation questions then, right? So people who may need access to healthcare, caseworkers and support management, people who need access to education and job training, schools, childcare, right? So really thinking about how do we support people to move into a house or an apartment or whatever, stay there, access the supports that they need. How do we help people stay in the housing that they have and access the things that they need? And so this is, I think, where I just wanted to end. One of the things that has really struck me, there's two things in homelessness that I think are particularly provocative within this audience context. One is that homeless services has been looking at a lot more models where the services are actually mobile. And so thinking about, well, let's not have people have to get to the services, but we can bring a lot of the services to the people in their homes, right? And there's a lot of really great reasons for that. I can talk about studies that they get into that, but I think it raises a lot of questions when we think about what does it mean to, what does it really actually mean to try and support services in houses. And I always try to talk about, we assume when we're building a housing unit or permitting a housing unit that there's going to be sewer and electricity, there's going to be water. When we make plans, we plan for parks and streets and transit and so forth. Why aren't we planning for accessing services of like healthcare, case management, the things that people who need to stay in housing, right? What are those things and how do we make sure they're able to get them in their housing? The other thing is, and I think this just, I want to just leave on this, is that because I think it highlights such a big disconnect between what it might mean to actually support people living in poverty versus, continuing with our long range planning in a way that's kind of detached, is that there are, when we often have to house people, particularly we've been having this experience with youth who are experiencing homelessness, they've ended up far out on our east side in Portland. And we know that's an area where there's a lot less transit accessibility, it's a lot harder to get around. And it's been moving young people into scattered site apartments where their support networks are no longer present. And so what's happened is we're now putting young people who have potentially been kicked out of their family for their gender identity into an apartment to live alone, isolated, with limited transit access. And there's been a couple of other studies that have also reinforced the idea that sometimes the best thing we could do for that person is actually give them a car. And it kills my little planning heart to say this. And, people in Portland really give me a dirty look when I say it, but anti-poverty tools, sometimes the best automobile. And so how do you reconcile with that and start to think about planning as being meaningful in a context where we're trying to manage growth, make the transit happen, do all the things, when today the best thing I could do for someone might be to give them a motor vehicle. Thanks.
Thanks so much. So we've had some theory, we've had some practitioner, we've had Dr. Sapad's work, sort of straddles theory and advocacy, I would say. And let's move into authority. with President Peterson, the head of the regional government here in Portland.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Michael. The takeaway for me from the last two presentations was the UGB is a great conversation starter of conversations that are really hard, right? And it's been my pleasure and honor and long nights to be part of a lot of conversations around issues inside the urban growth boundary as well as outside, and just the movement itself. So I wanted to take a little step away from the practitioner viewpoint and kind of talk about what the region is today, what lessons we've learned, and kind of where we're going. And I'll try and do that very quickly. So just a reminder, the population of the metropolitan service area of this region, which is slightly bigger than the metro service district boundary, quite a little bit bigger. We are the largest, 25th largest in the country out of 384 metropolitan service areas identified by the feds. So we're in the top upper echelon, along with Sacramento and San Antonio that people might be familiar with. Minneapolis, St. Paul that was referenced, which is our closest cousin in government structure, is 16th. So we increased in population between 2010 and 2020 by about 13%. And during that time period, we had the 2007 housing bubble burst, and no housing was built for a very long time period. Michael keeps track of this better than I do, but people kept coming. And so we have ended up with a much higher demand, along with less supply being built. So even if we had the best laid plans, we would not have been able to build during that time period. The size of the region is about 400 square miles, which is actually quite large for the population. People are, I think, rightly thinking about how you compare the Portland region in density. We are becoming more dense, but that doesn't mean that we are as dense as even some other cities. So we certainly are working in that direction, but being out on the West Coast with a lot of land, we definitely sprawled before we got smart. So on affordability, just FYI, the state is working us all towards a $15 hour minimum wage by, I believe, next year. But in the Portland metro region, prior to COVID, you needed a $20 an hour job in order to afford a 1-bedroom apartment. So that's the kind of affordability gap that we're looking at. Marisa pointed out the homeless issue and how it is increasing, and COVID certainly accelerated that. The median home price in the region is around $409,000, and the annual household income is about $78,000 a year. So it kind of tells you what people are able to afford out there and how things are the gap is starting to increase. 70% of Portland metro residents do drive alone. We are a driving culture while we have a great transit culture, and we are working towards increasing that. We are not exactly sitting in a really great position on transit because transit ridership has actually been going down. VMT per capita has also gone down. So we're doing a combination of things right, but we got to figure out how to get transit right for the future. For instance, this region does not have express bus service. It really doesn't. So trying to get people to jobs is difficult without having to change buses at least twice. And 18.5% speak a foreign language at home, which I think is actually pretty low compared to other large regions. So let's just focus on Metro for a moment. We are born, as Dr. Adler talked about, we are born out of a regional good governance conversation, and what services in the area needed to be regionalized. And that was established about 50 years ago. So we're a pretty newbie little government who is establishing the difference between its authority and its influence. And what we've learned is that our influence is pretty great when we all join hands and come to consensus. And so we spend a lot of time having a lot of good conversations between our communities about what makes them unique and why they want to remain unique. I am the elected president of the council. That means I'm elected region-wide of the whole 1.7 million. And I am an alumni of Portland State University for 2 master's degrees, both in urban planning and engineering. We have 6 counselors from the district, from their districts that we work together to keep a regional mindset at the same time trying to, again, allow each of our 23 cities and 3 counties to have their uniqueness to them. Our nearest relative, as I said, is Minneapolis-St. Paul, with a governor-appointed board and a similar set of regional services. We also provide waste and recycling responsibilities for the region that we try to integrate into everything that we do in terms of even homelessness, right? As our role, and we'll talk about this, has increased in the affordable housing provision and homeless support services, we have also networked in our illegal dumping program, because what has happened in this region is that folks that can no longer afford their garbage pickup, or folks that are just taking advantage of the fact that they might not have to pay for dumping stuff, are using homeless encampments as an illegal dumping base. And that is actually what is causing a lot of the issues around the region. So we are really trying to integrate that along with a racial equity lens on waste and recycling, because multifamily housing, which we want more of, those folks that live in multifamily housing want to recycle, but have a harder time getting access to services. So we are really working hard to make sure that we reduce the gaps in that. We have almost all the venues in the region between the convention center and the expo center, which we had to lay off 750 people. And we'll talk about what that meant when COVID hit. But we also have a regional park system and the land use and transportation planning as discussed. But I want to make sure you understand that we have the federal metropolitan planning organization role and authority. So we have to have the 20-year transportation plan, and the federal money flows through to the state, to the region. And then we have criteria about how we distribute it out to jurisdictional projects. But we are also the Oregon State Land Use Planning Program role and authority, which is to set the 20-year land use comprehensive plan with the goals that have been discussed. And we have a lot of authority there. And the authority lies in every single city and county have to be in compliance with the regional adopted land use plan for that 20-year. If they are not, we do have ways to bring them into compliance, including taking over their planning if necessary. So there is a difference between influence and authority. And and since we mentioned it, I just thought we would quickly go over that. But our role is changing based on the regional needs of today, right? And the needs of today are much different than 25 years ago when I first worked at Metro as a entry-level planner. We have homelessness and affordability is definitely up there. And in 2016, when we did a housing needs analysis for affordable and low-income housing, that's when we discovered we were in need of at least 45,000 affordable and low-income housing units in order to meet the need. And as I stated, people can't get jobs to afford a 1-bedroom apartment here. So in 2018, we passed the Affordable Housing Bond Measure, $652.8 million to provide 3,900 units, which seems like a small pittance to 45,000, which we all know is probably greater now after COVID. But it was a first step, and we are kicking ass on getting that out the door, and you can quote me on that. We have spent 30% of the funds and have already met 50% of the housing unit goal. So we're going to far exceed that. Very, very happy with our 7 partners who do housing provision in the region, and how they are they were ready to go, and we are getting it out there. We also then in 2020, in the midst of COVID, passed the Supportive Housing Services Measure that also helps us meet some affordable housing needs, because it's the wraparound services for those that need to get into housing, but it's also vouchers. So either using the vouchers in the private sector or in the public sector to actually fund the long-term maintenance of public housing. So we are now in the housing game. And the region wanted us there. And I think that's part of, how do you structure this so that there's a need? We also have been working to integrate our parks bond measure that passed in 2019 with affordable housing investments. And we worked to make our transportation bond measure that didn't pass this last November, but we're going to go at it again. We had a program in there to partner up with affordable housing investments as well. So we're trying to actualize, not just plan. And I think that's where nobody would have predicted back, 50 years ago, that this organization that they created would have the flexibility to move from the visioning to the planning to the implementation, and be a partner on the ground with our cities and counties. Having said that, the politics around the money that's raised at the regional level, the only way we got to agreement is for each county, whatever is raised in each county stays in each county. And with many of our bond measures, we also have a local share. So while we're trying to meet regional needs, there always needs to be a piece that goes to the local jurisdictions for their own priorities, as long as they are in coordination and meeting the goals of the region. So that's how we work our politics here. And it's been working very well in terms of implementation. On the urban growth boundary, we do have to have that 20-year plan, but it's based on a 50-year vision, the 2040 growth concept that was created in mid-90s. It is an important piece of not just our narrative, but it's a map that I look at on a daily basis for the 30 years that I've been in planning, and I still find new things that are integrated and thought about to this day, but we do need to update it. When we first created the framework for Metro 2040, it was the first regional plan in the United States, and it was the first to use scenario planning. So the question was, do we grow out, grow up, or a combination of both? And a huge community engagement process, because John Friganese, who led it as the director of planning inside Metro, taught the agency and the region and the region's electeds to trust the people. It was the beginning of the creation of a culture in Metro to trust the people. That's really hard for a lot of people. They want to see their vision actualized, right? Their interchange in the list, their downtown on the map. But in reality, there are things that are much more important to the people who actually need to use the transport system or live and work and play in this area. So we chose a combination of grow up and grow out as our future vision. And it was based on, like we said, a reduction in sprawl as a value, saving farm and forest land as a value, integrating transport and land use. Sustainability was the key word of the day, along with livability. And by that, we then promoted downtowns and main streets and corridors, increased density in those nodes and those corridors. The lessons learned from the implementation over the last 20 years, while it was a tough conversation, we did find consensus in the vision, because it was 50 years and it was big, it was broad, it was engaging. And the cities then actually changed their zoning and codes to meet the vision and the 20-year plan. I think to this day that's amazing that 23 cities and 3 counties actually came into compliance on a regional plan. Later, we had to create urban and rural reserves because we just had wide swaths of area with no way to actually have a conversation, as Laura mentioned, on where and how to grow into or outside the urban growth boundary. So we stopped the continual debate and we focused it. And we still have a lot to learn on how to use that land more wisely, as Laura mentioned, but I think that it's now focused the conversation, and instead of being so big and broad, we can actually have the conversation she wants to have. We also found that the cost of time and system development charges to pay for infrastructure or parks are driving up the cost of homes statewide, as well as in the region. And the state's adoption and the city's adoption of a missing middle type of housing requirement has very much helped, but the what we didn't realize when we were doing this 20 years ago is that we were not focusing on the preservation of existing affordable housing. We were only focused on new development, and that's costly. So what we know now is that we have to focus on both. And that we also learned that we need to provide a flexible framework in order to meet outcomes as they change, because the Metro 2040 is still a great framework, but there's a whole bunch that we need to start talking about on a Metro 2070, which is going to be interesting. We also have a UGB decision coming up in another 2.5 years that this should feed into. So while every decision we now make at Metro has a racial equity and climate change lens applied to it, there are two things that, well, there's a whole list, and I'm just going to rattle these off really fast and be done. Everything that I list was not a conversation 20 years ago when we first created the Metro 2040. What does community engagement look like this time? Who conducts it? How are we accessible and open? And are we letting the people, a diverse enough amount of people, actually have access to the conversation and get done? Racial equity, beyond safe and inviting spaces and placemaking, blah, blah, blah. Are we actually generating generational wealth opportunities, such as the Albina Vision Trust, that if folks want to Google that, you should. It's being able to finally restore pieces of a Black community called Albina that was destroyed by an interstate, by a coliseum, by a stadium, by the convention center. And now we're looking to use the lid on the interstate that's going to be built to actually hand that over to a Black-owned trust or a Black-run trust to be able to create generational wealth. So we're creating land and putting it into the hands of those who know what they need in order to have that generational wealth. How do we set goals for employment in the region so that the jobs are fulfilling and pay to be able to enjoy this region and afford this region? And related to that, how do we actually grow companies locally, homegrown companies who care about their communities and their employees so that we are not ruled by Wall Street, but by Main Street? How do we do that? Affordability, we've talked about this a little bit, but there's a lot more there to dig into. Industrial land, trends in distribution centers and manufacturing. What are we seeing? How do we increase infill rates when there are brownfields and utility issues to existing sites? Autonomous vehicles, how do they change behavior? Frickin' COVID. Office space is going to change. All day traffic congestion, transit needs are changing, safety needs. We have daycare deserts that we've never even thought about, but now we have to. The accessibility that we have, whether that's broadband or transit, and investing in low income and BIPOC communities first and listening to their needs rather than thinking that we know best of what they need. And I'll end on congestion pricing, natural disasters, and the majority of the goals in the program, which are never used, like energy. So there you go. We got a shit ton of work to do, and I encourage you all to follow us or help us, please. Thank you.
Thanks so much. I'm amused by the gradually escalating breadth of everybody's talk so far and the gradually escalating alarm as we talk about the challenges before us. So let's see. I want to open with a sort of quick question, then I'll switch to some audience questions and I'll fill in after that. But I'm going to ask all the speakers if it's possible to unmute so we can get crosstalk if we need to, and jump in on, you can each jump in on your peers' thoughts. But I want to start with something just in 30 seconds or less from each of you. I'd love to get, one of the things that I like about, a point that Dr. Zapata made about this not having been an expensive city, a hip city, just a few years ago, speaks to the fact that this could be like a lot of different places. It could be San Antonio or Cincinnati or Jacksonville or Guadalajara or Ningbo. It could be lots of different cities of this size. And what would be the evolution? Like, where's the specific things that might change over the following 40 years? So I'd love to think about that by thinking about like one specific example of a place within the UGB that you think would be different today without that UGB. If that makes sense.
Well, I'm from San Antonio. Can I just talk about what it looks like in San Antonio? I think that, I'll be honest, when I first moved to Portland, I was not as impressed by the density as I expected to be. I thought it was going to be a much denser city. And of course, I know that the development patterns, particularly for East County, We're quite different, and the density kicks in at a different point, and we'll be seeing the density infill happening. But I will say that after being here for a few years, I went back to San Antonio, Texas, and you can see the differences, not just in the fact that they make you pump your own gas there, but in the size of the gas station lots. It was amazing. It was amazing. And it's a really small thing, but I think that that's where you start to get into demonstrating the commitment to the values, right? And so if you drive up in San Antonio to a gas station that's been recently built, there was enough room for a double wide truck to drive through and park, have one park across at the other pump, and another one can drive through the middle. And
Awesome.
I just think it's a very small example, but the kind of sprawl that has happened there, it's just even down to the lot size, right? Everyone, I live in a skinny house, and my skinny house wouldn't be here without the UGB. I'm up in St. John's, right? And so I think it's thinking about these things that we see more in the infill way than necessarily, this big specific area that would look radically different. And then, yeah, go to San Antonio and check out the gas stations.
Awesome. Who's next?
Well, I can
Good
just
Lord.
say, yeah, I was just going to say that I grew up, speaking of where we're from, and I grew up in Knoxville, Tennessee. And one of the things that I've always noticed about Knoxville is that there's this huge, long strip of kind of a 5-way road that runs along the whole spine of the city across the whole region. And every year I go back, some huge strip mall development has been abandoned, and there's a new one next door to it, which I've never understood, because the idea is don't infill, don't take the land that you already have that's already been being used and fill it in. Just keep going out further and further and further. And so that is, and you wouldn't see that here. That's not possible here. So I think that that's a big difference that I see.
I think what I would say is we would probably look more like the Puget Sound region without the urban growth boundary, because the intent was to have pearls along Interstate 5 as individual cities that were supported rather than having them all blend into each other. And I think that we have been able to not sprawl down the valley and take up all the farmland. So yeah, thank you. Puget Sound, Seattle area. But it allows for the uniqueness, it allows for the distinction, and it allows for that allows for that conversation of how do we create the main street that we have to be just as vibrant as the lifestyle center, right? We don't need 12 lifestyle centers. We actually have 12 downtowns. One lifestyle center, love it, go there all the time. But I don't need 12 of them.
I'd love to have other members of the audience drop questions in. There's one question from Jason about the UGB. What can be done differently to make it more effective? So I'll jump to that. What do each of you see as the biggest past failures or future challenges for the land use planning system? Each of you discussed that in your own things, but I'd love to get a quick answer of like one specific problem that you would like it to address to fulfill your hopes for it.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the biggest weakness right now is that historically Metro and DLCD have not chosen to try to litigate on trying to push affordable housing, right? And so it's this constant, we have a compact, we'll do everything by consensus. And I'm not making fun of President Peterson. This is what everyone says all the time. And it hasn't happened, right? And so I'm done with the carrots. We need sticks. It has to happen, and it hasn't before. That's my summary.
I guess what I would say is that we as a region and a culture, as a state, have been anti-growth. And that has not just played over into disinvestment. It just because there is a culture of belief that if we invest, we'll be nicer and more people will come, but the people came. So it's not just about single family housing and paving over farm and forest to me. It's actually that we have not been pro-employment growth. And because we haven't been able to figure out how to have a conversation about how we still retain our livability while we grow industry and good jobs. We have not been able to figure out that conversation. And to me, we'll just keep increasing homelessness because nobody can actually afford to live here, but they need the jobs. So they'll take whatever job they can get, and hopefully, right? So we're never going to get out of the spiral that we're in. We can bring up all the social services. We can bring up all of the affordable housing that we possibly can. We can push forward on more affordable housing, but until these two are more in balance, we're just going to keep the problem intensifying.
Laura.
I think that in the kind of the central city, we push a lot of density, but I still don't think that we're pushing enough density and infill throughout the rest of the region. The areas on the edges, they're not full up. They need to be more dense, and we need to be making that happen. And we need to be requiring density inside the urban growth boundary before we're kind of looking, along with going outside the urban growth boundary, because we need just housing, period. So anywhere we can get it. But I think focusing internally would be a good way to go.
That's mandatory minimum zoning, forcing people to buy more land if they want to live on a low density context. Is that how that manifests?
I'm sorry, repeat the question.
Sorry, is it that you're talking about like a mandatory minimum density of zoning?
That's what I believe. Yes,
Yeah.
I think it should be a minimum. I know that folks around here wouldn't be happy with that, but I think that's kind of what we need.
It's not about making everyone happy. We actually, in fact, have to make a lot of people very mad. That is
unhappy
okay.
already.
I'm from
Right.
Texas. I'm not from the Pacific Northwest. Anger is okay.
I love this contrarian question from Rob in the audience. Increasingly, we're talking about a lot of things regionally, and I think that's been a big part of President Peterson's explicit agenda, is to be trying to think more regionally about things. But are there any issues that you don't think should be addressed regionally? What are things that are optimal, each of you, optimally controlled at the city level? If anything, maybe cities, should go the way of boroughs.
No, I think having been a city councilor, a county commissioner, and now a regionalist, I think Rob's question is a very, very good one, because I believe that the cities are the closest to the people, and they actually have they have their ear to the ground. And when I was a city councilor, I couldn't go into Safeway and get out in 5 minutes, right? Because I would get asked a gazillion questions because I was recognized and blah, 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 right? So, and now as Metro Council president, yeah, people know me, but not like when I was a city councilor going into my local Safeway. So I believe in local government, closest to the people, should be able to articulate and work on behalf of. Obviously, land use and transportation are really important, but then there's obviously no system is just a local system, because we're all operating together, and it doesn't, nobody cares when they're on their bike or on the bus or in their car if they've just gone from one city to another city. They just want the road to not have a pothole. They want to make sure that they're safe, and they want to make sure that the system is functionally optimally, and they don't give a rat's ass all these different, I don't care when we regionalize. I think it's when the cities and counties see that they can't do it themselves alone. And that's what happened with the affordable housing conversation. They're like, we're overwhelmed. This isn't happening. We need help, right? And then you start to have the conversation, should it be regionalized? I think the massive underfunding of counties and cities has led to a growth in regionalism in this area.
Interesting.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting, because I think about what are the appropriate points of intervention based on the systems and how they interact. And so it becomes a de facto regional argument, right? Because housing systems, for instance, are not constrained by boundaries and jurisdictions. And the more that we rely on that, the worse we make our housing issues, right? But then frankly, we should also be having the regionalization should cross the river into Washington, because what's happening in Washington matters to our situation in Oregon as well. I'm not sure that I think anything when you're in a metropolitan area is better planned at the city level. I also simply don't have President Peterson's faith that city councilors are that connected to what people want, particularly people from low income communities of color, immigrant communities, people who are highly vulnerable and marginalized. But I do think that that raises an interesting question that maybe what is the appropriate, there should maybe the appropriate space for that kind of engagement and deliberation are at neighborhood and city levels, right? And that's where that work should be happening. Whereas the implementation of policy decisions should be a more regional framing. I mean, you can't do economics and housing and transit city by city in a metro area, right? It doesn't make any sense.
Yeah.
Right. And the only thing I would say is I totally agree with Marisa about who gets elected is not necessarily representation of the people with the perspectives that we need to make full decisions. I agree. But going to the neighborhood level and the amount of power that we as a society in different major metropolitan cities have put into neighborhoods, and the leadership there is even worse in terms of not hearing, because it's only homeowners, right? With a very distinct view of no change. So I think the whole system needs to be reset over time. And there's some massive governance issues in this region and the state that need to be changed in order to start to level out the power indifference, the power, just I can't say it right now, but the power needs to be more levelly distributed.
That's why you've been working in cities. And what powers don't you have that cities should have?
All the power. No, I don't want all the power. As a city, I do believe, I mean, I'm a big believer in regional government. I think that to Lynn's point is that people get on a bicycle or people move around and they don't know where they are. Half the people that live in certain areas think that they live in another city because it's called Hillsborough when they're really living in Beaverton, or vice versa. So I think those lines are only visible to the people that are governing them sometimes, but they're also visible to decision makers that have been able to kind of have an exclusivity within their own city because they've decided that they're going to grow in a particular way. And so you're not getting a mix of incomes in all the different cities. And I think that should be discussed regionally, that there should be more of the dispersal of that income across all of the regions. So you're not creating these wealthy enclaves. So but I do believe that the conversation can start locally, and then it has to feed up into a regional conversation, because to Lynn's point, again, she's out there talking to folks, and also to Maurice's point, it's maybe not all of the folks that we really need to be talking to. So like Lynn said, it's really complicated. We have a lot of work to do. We need to restructure everything, and that's going to be really impossible, but we leave it to you, Lynn, to figure out, since you're the council, since you're the president.
And as a first step, let's name some names by answering this question in the audience. I'm very interested in hearing about the 23 local governments that changed their plans to comply with regional vision. From each of you, any of you, what are some specific cities that have changed course as a result of the UGB and the land use goals that Dr. Adler talked about, and so on? Like, what's something you can cite as a path that was not taken?
All of them. All of them had changed course, but I guess I would say that generally, you know, when you look back, I'm going to pick on Gresham only because I think that as they came into this discussion about regionalism, the leadership back then was very anti-metro. And as they urbanized, as the urban issues have increased, they have become much more interested in partnering, to the point where now I think the leadership there is like, we need a metro, right? So for me, it's where were the cities on their urbanization curve that dictates their politics. And many of them did the minimum, and many of them did way more than minimum. And so I would say Gresham on the east side probably started with the minimum and is now trying to get to a maximum, right? Hillsborough came in with kind of a middle ground and has now exceeded like everything that you could have imagined. Embraced it, partnership, but not like full on, and now full on, right? So I think it's where you're at on your urbanization curve that dictates your politics.
So two very different economic contexts too. That Gresham has fewer jobs, less money. Hillsborough has Intel and a lot more jobs and more money.
Yep. But that wasn't always true.
Right.
So, I mean,
right.
Depending on where they were, again, it's just, yeah, it's interesting to me. When you look at one specific example, 3 counties in the Portland metro region, right? 3 levels of urbanization issues. City of Portland and Multnomah County had to deal with sewer issues first, right? Where there was too much unsewered homes. And so they had to deal with the fact that they had to annex people in to get them sewered up. Those were like their sewer wars, right? None of those people actually wanted to be part of the city of Portland. They left the city of Portland because they didn't want the urban issues, quote, right? 20 years later, Washington County finds itself in the exact same position to have to deal with a regionalization on one side of the region. And it's not easy. Again, not easy. And 20 years later, I'm caught, as a Clackamas County commissioner in a sewer war about how do we actually make all this happen and have it affordable to a lower income community, right? So to me, it's just very interesting to see how these issues play out around the region as they mature. And maybe that's too rational. That's my MERP degree coming out.
Anything on that? We can move on to the next if anybody else is ready. Okay, cool. I really want to ask this one. So as somebody who usually votes Democratic and also as a fan of the UGB, I'm still surprised how committed the Democratic Party in Oregon is to the urban growth boundary and to anti-sprawl issues. It seems like there's a really high salience to that within the Democratic Party, at least among elites. And I wonder what do you attribute that? And I'd be curious about any other thoughts you might have on the sort of secondary political effects of the urban growth boundary on Oregon's politics.
I want to actually ask you why you're surprised.
I guess it seems like the
I mean, to me, it is very Oregon specific. That is for sure. And I think one of the most important effects that it has is that you can actually describe yourself as a land use planner in Oregon, and random people know who that is, what that is, right? So I think that that's a big thing. But yes, tell me why you're surprised.
I guess because it cuts across ideological boundaries in other ways, and it seems to me like it's a very material thing that I'm surprised that it would be such a central tenet of sort of the center left party. Yeah.
I mean, I've always interpreted, and this is where I really wish Cy was here, because he would definitely have a historical context answer for us that would be quite profound. That part of it's just, the bedfellows that were made in trying to protect environmental and farmland simultaneously, right? That was, and there's always been something linked to that progressive Oregon spirit, and the urban growth boundary and protecting the land goes with that, right? And so I don't see them as like separatable things. And now that they're here, I think it's actually much harder to get rid of it, right? Like convincing a bunch of people in Texas they should be anti-sprawl is real hard at this point. But if they had been anti-sprawl and convinced of it 50 years ago, it'd probably just be there. It's one of those things that I think makes sense once you got it hooked in. I don't know if that makes sense. But yeah, I mean, it is one of those things that I feel like it's a pretty locked in thing. Although, I mean, it wasn't like there were a bunch of votes on it. I mean,
every 2 years,
20 years.
80s,
yeah.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. But it's been held in esteem for some time. So
I feel like it's part of the Oregon culture at this point, to your point,
yeah.
Maurice. I mean, it is just really a foundational to what Oregonians believe in. And people, I think, that move here on some level are also interested in that. I mean, yes, I have planning tendencies and that's why I moved here, but I had always heard about this thing. And after growing up in a sprawling area, when I heard, wait, there's this place that doesn't allow you to do that, I want to move there. So then I think the culture just builds upon itself because you kind of attract more people that are supportive of that idea. And it's just become a part of who we are as a state, really, or as a metropolitan region, I guess. I mean, I think maybe across the state, they might beg to differ. They may not have as strong foundation in that, but I think that generally, yeah, it's just part of our culture at this point.
I would just go back to the fact that all of this is true, but that the Oregon Land Use Planning Program goal number 1 is community engagement. Now, have we done that right all the time? No, we got to learn how to do it better. But it is the underlying number 1 thing that people actually, I mean, the fact that they can still cite a UGB at a, you know, a cocktail party is just amazing to me, right? So I think we do have some work ahead because that is decreasing. That community awareness about an urban growth boundary is decreasing, and making the connection between everyone's livability and the conversation that is created over urban growth boundary discussion, right? We have a lot of work to do on that.
Is that based on polls? I assume that you're speaking about data that you've seen.
Well, I mean, the state voted down the Oregon Land Use Planning Program not so long ago, and the state legislature had to save it and put it back out on the ballot, and we brought most of it back, right? But we did lose pieces of it. And so, yes, yes, people are definitely not understanding the Oregon Land Use Planning Program model. They might be able to say the word UGB, but they're not connecting this statewide program that was created by a Republican governor and Republican legislators,
right,
to the livability of the region. Yeah.
Well, we've got 5 minutes left, so let's close with each of you sharing 1 bit of research that could inform progress toward your goals that we talked about earlier. What's something that our audience should be learning and sharing?
So I'm trying to think of how to phrase this. The hardest work to do in housing and homelessness is not how to produce the housing or how to solve homelessness. We know how to solve homelessness, it's with housing. The hard work is moving power and moving money to do the right thing. And I actually find a lot of the research that I'm asked to do, and that I know that a lot of us in land use and in transportation are asked to do, is really more about allowing jurisdictions, allowing elected officials and people in power to continue to tinker around the edges with things. So how do we get capitalism to be a little less terrible and maybe make 1 more affordable housing unit? How do we, I'm asked, how do I prioritize? If I have $100, which family is most likely to become homeless? Who should I give it to? I'm like, well, they're both suffering. That's a problem, right? So we get asked to do a lot about that. And so it's always like, when I think about like some of the big scenario planning work that I've been involved in, it's like, do we want to reduce vehicles miles traveled and greenhouse gas emissions by this much or this much? And I get it, right? That's what our electeds, that's what our cities and our communities ask for. But what does it look like to do research, particularly with the kind of quantitative skill sets I know a lot of this audience has, an ability to use big data? What does it look like to actually say, we want whole-scale systematic change for social justice? And how do we use the analytics and the skills and the research capabilities that we have to create a research agenda that is solely about that, right? That's about putting knowledge in the hands of activists, for people who are working on social justice, and to bring that knowledge to really produce the change that we really all want, right? We all want the big things. So how do we use research to get there?
Cool. And I'm sorry to hit the accelerator here, but Laura, then Lynn.
Well, I'll just go. That was very high level, very big picture, very big thinking, all the way down to my little practitioner out in the streets listening to people talk to me every day. And all I can say is the literature that I look at the most is about parking. How can I convince people to not need so much parking? So anything you can give me that's very specific and very use focused makes my job easier and helps me get less parking. That's it.
I'll just end on what is becoming just my mission in this job for the next 5 years if elected again. The idea that Marisa posed, but from the perspective of what are the carrots and sticks to actually grow local companies that are similar to B Corps, but they're putting their money into Oregonians and care about the outcomes. Because jobs are not all equal, and we need to make sure that there's a minimum expectation culturally, as well as financially, of how do we support our employees in this region, and not think that it's okay to have pay that's less than what it costs to live here. And all you have to do is give them a transportation stipend of $50 a month, which is what some companies are doing, right? Because people have to move so far away. So I could use best practices from other countries. I think this region really looks to other countries for ideas, sometimes other regions, but you know, a lot of Canada, a lot of Europe, we need ideas. We need an influx of ideas. And you just heard the types of things that the long laundry list that I have of things that we're going to have to figure out how, not necessarily how to answer into Metro 2070 update, but how to provide a framework that allows for the flexibility to succeed on those. And the capitalism is the underpinning of the problem here, is how do we have a better culture around capitalism?
All right, that's swinging it back for the fences again, and I'll bring things back to Dr. Clifton to close things out with a few announcements. Thanks so much to the whole panel and for the invitation to join.
Yeah, fantastic. Thank you, Michael, for moderating, and thank you, Laura, Lynn, Marisa, and Sai for an engaging presentation about what Portland is up to. Just a few comments and announcements to everyone before you leave the session. We have one more session today and then another packed day tomorrow. We have another plenary with Juan Pablo Bocarejo from Bogota, who's going to talk about his both academic and practice in the city of Bogota. And I think there's a lot of lessons there that could apply to Portland. We also have an interactive session about the future of research agenda of this organization. So please fill out my survey before this evening so I don't have to get up really early to analyze it all. We only have 27 responses and I know you guys have lots of good ideas. And then finally, the closing session. So we have some big announcements to make tomorrow at 4 o'clock Portland time. So I look forward to seeing you all, and thanks again, you guys, for such an engaging and interesting panel.
Are we hanging out while people clear out?
We can, but we're still broadcasting.
I know.